The year of our Lord. 1873 was a thirsty one in the New Mexico territory. The sun was a relentless hammer, beating down on a land that had long since surrendered. It baked the plains into a cracked ochre canvas, bleached the bones of forgotten cattle, and drew shimmering ghosts of heat from the iron rails that cut a defiant line across the horizon. Upon these rails, a train, a black serpent of steam and steel, groaned its way east. It was a lonely procession, its plume of coal smoke a fleeting stain against a sky of hard, unforgiving blue. Each turn of its massive wheels was a rhythmic, percussive heartbeat, clack-clack, clack-clack, a sound of progress in a land that time seemed to have forgotten. Inside the last car, a place for freight and the occasional passenger who valued solitude over comfort, sat a man named Silas Boone. He was as much a part of the landscape as the mesas that stood like solemn sentinels in the distance. Tall and broad, he seemed to fill the corner he occupied without effort. His face was a map of hard miles and quiet years, tanned the color of worn leather and etched with lines that spoke not of age, but of sun and wind and thought. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were fixed on the passing desolation, but their gaze was distant, as if he were looking at a memory rather than the scenery. He wore a duster coat, the kind favored by men who spent more time on a horse than on their own 2 feet. It was made of heavy, tan canvas, and it fell to his worn boots, a shield against the elements. The coat was not just dusty, it was imbued with the very essence of the West. The fine, pale grit was worked into every seam, a testament to countless days on the trail. It carried the faint, honest sense of leather, horse, and the dry, clean smell of the high desert. Silas sat perfectly still, a study in patience, his large, calloused hands resting on his knees. He was a man who knew how to wait. He had waited for rain in a dry season, for a fever to break, for the right moment to draw a gun. Now, he was simply waiting for the train to reach its destination. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels was the only sound, a lulling, monotonous song that seemed to stretch into eternity. The peace was shattered not by a sound, but by a change in rhythm. The latch on the heavy sliding door at the end of the car rattled a frantic, metallic scratching that was entirely separate from the train's steady motion. Silas's eyes shifted from the window to the door, his posture unchanged, but a new stillness, one of alert attention, settled over him. The door slid open a few inches with a tortured groan, and for a moment, only the blinding white light of the desert filled the gap. Then she stumbled in. She was less a person and more a frantic whisper of one. A girl, perhaps 18 or 19 years of age, though hardship had smudged the lines of her youth. Her dress, a simple calico that might have once been a cheerful blue, was now faded to the color of a washed-out sky, torn at the hem and stained with grime. Her feet were bare, scratched and bruised, and her dark hair had escaped its bindings, tangled with burrs and bits of dried grass. She moved with the desperate, panicked energy of a cornered animal, her chest heaving with ragged, painful breaths that were more like sobs. She slammed the door shut, the heavy wood and iron groaning in protest, and leaned against it, her small frame trembling violently. Her eyes wide and the color of dark honey were the focal point of her terrified face. They darted around the empty car, seeing the stacked crates, the rough-hewn wooden walls, and finally, the large, still figure in the corner. For a heartbeat, their eyes met. Silas saw a terror so pure and profound it seemed to have hollowed her out from the inside. He saw not just fear of pursuit, but a deeper, more abiding fear of what that pursuit represented. She, in turn, saw a man who seemed as solid and unmovable as the mountains themselves. His stillness was not threatening. It was absolute. He was a fact, a presence that offered no judgment, no immediate threat, only a quiet, watchful calm. Her gaze dropped from his face to the voluminous duster coat that enveloped him. An idea, born of pure, primal instinct, flickered in her panicked eyes. She pushed herself off the door and took a hesitant step toward him. Then another. She moved as if wading through deep water. Every movement an immense effort against the weight of her fear. When she was a few feet away, she stopped. She didn't speak at first, her lips trembling as she tried to form words. The only sounds were her own ragged breathing and the relentless clatter of the train. "Please," she finally whispered. The word a raw, broken thing, barely audible over the noise. "Mr. Please." Silas did not move a muscle. He did not ask her name, nor what she was running from. He did not ask who was after her or why. In his world, a person in this much trouble rarely had the time for questions, and the answers were often dangerous to know. He had seen that look in the eyes of wounded animals and desperate men. The story was written plainly in her terror. The details did not matter. She raised a trembling hand and pointed not at him, but at the coat. Can I hide just for a minute? Please." Her plea was not for a hero. It was for a shadow, for a temporary oblivion. It was the prayer of a rabbit seeking the cover of a thicket with the hounds closing in. For a long moment, Silas simply looked at her. The train swayed, and a sliver of sunlight from a grimy window pane cut across the car, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air between them. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion that was utterly devoid of hurry or alarm, he moved. He did not stand. He simply shifted his weight and lifted his right arm, raising the heavy canvas flap of his duster. It was not a grand gesture. It was a simple, quiet offering. He created a space, a dark, protected void beside his own body. He opened a sanctuary. The girl, whose name was Ellie, needed no further invitation. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, a small, desperate creature seeking refuge. She crawled into the space he had made, curling herself into a tight ball against the hard wooden bench and the solid warmth of his side. The rough, dusty fabric of the coat settled over her, and the world outside disappeared. The blinding desert light was replaced by a comforting darkness, thick and close. The roar of the train was instantly muffled, reduced to a distant, rumbling heartbeat. The air under the coat was warm and smelled of the man himself, that clean, honest scent of dust and leather, with an underlying hint of tobacco and something uniquely his own, something solid and reassuring, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. Ellie could not be seen. She pressed her face against the rough material of Silas's trousers, squeezed her eyes shut, and tried to make her trembling cease. Outside the cocoon of canvas, Silas slowly lowered his arm. The duster settled back into place, looking only slightly more rumpled than before. To a casual observer, he was once again just a man sitting alone in the corner of an empty freight car. But he was no longer at rest. A subtle tension had entered his stillness. His body was a shield, and he could feel the small, terrified life huddled against him, her shivers vibrating faintly through his own frame. His gaze, no longer distant, was now fixed on the door she had come through. His hand, which had been resting on his knee, had moved, his fingers now lightly touching the worn wooden grip of the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. He did not know her name. He did not know her crime or her innocence. But she had asked for shelter, and he had given it. Out here, in a land where laws were few and mercy was a rare commodity. Sometimes that was all a man had to go on. A silent pact had been forged in the rattling, swaying car, a connection made not with words, but with a shared breath in the dark. The train continued its relentless journey east, carrying its silent passenger and his hidden, trembling secret across the vast, indifferent desert. And Silas Boone, the quiet man in the dusty coat, continued to wait. But now, he was waiting for something different. He was waiting for whatever was chasing the girl to come through that door. Time in the freight car was measured in the rhythmic clack of wheels and the frantic pounding of Ellie's own heart. Tucked into the darkness of Silas's duster, the world was reduced to sensation. The rough texture of canvas against her cheek, the solid, unyielding warmth of the man's leg beside her, and the muffled, monotonous thunder of the train moving ever onward. She tried to make herself smaller, to breathe more shallowly, to cease to exist. Every vibration of the floorboards sent a fresh jolt of terror through her, a dread that the door would slide open again. She prayed to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore, prayed for the train to never stop, to carry her into oblivion. Silas remained a statue of dusty canvas. He had not shifted, not even to ease a cramp. His body was a wall, and through it, Ellie could feel a deep, resonant calm that was the very opposite of her own panic. It was an anchor in her storm. She didn't know this man, had no reason to trust him beyond this single, unspoken act of charity. But in the suffocating darkness, she clung to his stillness as a dying woman clings to a last breath. The change, when it came, was a jarring scrape of metal on metal that cut through the train's rhythm. It was a deliberate, heavy sound, the sound of a door being forced. Ellie's breath caught in her throat, a tiny, strangled gasp that was lost in the noise. Under the coat, she went rigid. The door slid open, flooding the car with a rectangle of harsh, white sunlight and the silhouettes of 3 men. They stepped inside, their heavy boots thudding on the wooden floor, each footfall a hammer blow against Ellie's nerves. They paused for a moment, letting their eyes adjust to the gloom. "Smells like cattle and sawdust in here," a gruff voice drawled. It was a low, gravelly sound, thick with contempt. "Check the crates." "Finn." "Ain't nothing here." "Jebediah." "A second," whinier voice replied. There was the sound of a heavy boot kicking a wooden crate, followed by a hollow bang that made Ellie flinch so violently she was sure Silas must have felt it. Check him anyway. She's a slippery little thing. Can't have gone far. The man called Jebediah was the largest of the 3. He was barrel-chested, with a florid face and a thick, greasy mustache that failed to hide the cruel set of his mouth. He wore a stained waistcoat over a sweat-dampened shirt, and his eyes, small and porcine, swept the car before finally landing on the solitary figure of Silas Boone. He sauntered over, his boots making the floorboards groan. The other man, Finn, a wiry, ferret-faced individual, began half-heartedly nudging boxes with his foot. The third man, a hulking brute with a vacant expression, remained by the open door, effectively blocking the only exit. Jebediah stopped a few feet from Silas, planting his feet wide. The air around him was thick with the sour smell of cheap whiskey and unwashed bodies. "Well now," he said, his voice oozing a false geniality. "Just sitting in the dark. Friend." Silas did not look up immediately. He let the question hang in the air, another sound in the cacophony of the train. Finally, he lifted his head, his gray eyes meeting Jebediah's without a flicker of fear or interest. They were calm, measured, and gave away nothing. "Passin' the time," Silas said, his voice a low baritone, as steady as the horizon. Jebediah chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. "Passin' the time. I like that." He gestured vaguely around the car. "We're looking for someone. A girl. Runaway piece of property. You might say, 'bout so high. Dark hair. Probably looking like a half-drowned cat. You ain't seen anyone like that come through here, have you?" Huddled in the darkness, Ellie felt a cold sweat break out on her skin. Property. The word struck her with the force of a physical blow. That was all she was to them. Not a person, but a thing to be owned and reclaimed. "Can't say I have," Silas replied, his tone flat and final. Jebediah's smile tightened. He took another step closer, looming over the seated man. "You sure about that, 'cause there ain't nowhere else to go on this here train? And my employer, Mr. Gable. He gets mighty particular about his possessions. There's a reward for her return, and a whole mess of trouble for anyone who helps her stay lost." The threat was as plain as the pistol grip sticking out of Jebediah's belt. Silas's gaze didn't waver. He seemed to look straight through the bigger man, his composure an unbreachable fortress. He had dealt with men like Jebediah his entire life. They were loud because they were weak, and they used threats as a substitute for strength. The real danger was the quiet kind, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. Finn, having finished his cursory search of the crates, wandered over. "Nothing. Jeb, just this old fella." He squinted at Silas, his beady eyes taking in the dusty duster. "That's a mighty big coat you got there, mister. Must be warm in this heat." Ellie's blood ran cold. She felt as though their eyes were boring through the canvas, stripping away her only protection. She held her breath, convinced that the frantic beating of her heart was loud enough for them to hear. She could feel the heat radiating from Silas's body, a stark contrast to the icy dread that filled her. Jebediah's eyes narrowed, a flicker of suspicion dawning. He looked down at the coat, at the way it draped, perhaps a little too unevenly, over Silas's frame. "He's right," Jebediah said slowly, a predatory gleam in his eye. "It's a big coat. Maybe you ought to stand up. Friend, stretch your legs. Let's see what you're sitting on." This was it, the moment the fragile piece would shatter. Silas did not need to ask Ellie what she had done, or why these men wanted her. He could feel the terror pouring off her in waves. He could smell the whiskey and cheap malevolence on them. He knew their kind. They were buzzards, drawn to the weak and the helpless. There was no law in this rattling box, only a simple, brutal equation of power. Silas didn't move. He simply held Jebediah's gaze. "I'm comfortable where I am." The insolence of his quiet refusal was more effective than a shouted threat. Jebediah's face flushed a deeper red. "I ain't asking you if you're comfortable," he snarled, his hand dropping to rest on the butt of his pistol. "I'm telling you, get up." The world slowed down. Ellie could hear the rasp of Jebediah's breath, the creak of his leather belt. Underneath her, she felt a subtle shift in the man beside her. It wasn't a movement so much as a gathering of energy, a tightening of muscle, like a cougar coiling before a strike. Then everything happened at once. In a movement too fast to follow, Silas surged upward. He didn't just stand. He exploded from his seated position. He wasn't aiming for the man's gun. He was aiming for the man. His shoulder drove hard into Jebediah's chest, a battering ram of bone and muscle. The air left Jebediah's lungs in a grunt of pained surprise, and he staggered backward, tripping over his own feet and crashing into the unsuspecting Finn. The two men went down in a tangle of limbs and curses. In that same motion, Silas's hand shot out and grabbed Ellie's arm. He pulled her from her hiding place, yanking her into the harsh light and onto her feet. The sudden shift from darkness to light, from stillness to violent motion, was dizzying. The world was a blur. "Hey," the big man at the door shouted, fumbling to react. But Silas wasn't going that way. He spun, pulling Ellie with him, and headed not for the door they'd come in, but for the large sliding freight door on the side of the car. The wind roared past the moving train, a constant, deafening howl. With one hand still gripping Ellie's arm, Silas used his other to wrench the heavy latch. It was stiff with rust and disuse, but with a grunt of effort, he threw his weight against it, and the door slid open with a screech of protesting metal. The world outside was a terrifying, beautiful blur of ochre, sagebrush, and pale blue sky, all of it hurtling past at an impossible speed. The roar of the wind and the wheels was overwhelming. Below, the ground was a river of gravel and rock. "Get up, you fool!" Jebediah was screaming from behind them, scrambling to untangle himself from Finn. There was no time to think. There was no choice. Silas looked down at Ellie. Her face was white with terror, her eyes wide pools of shock, but she was on her feet, her small hand clutching his arm as if it were the only solid thing in the universe. Now Silas's voice was a raw command, cutting through the chaos. He didn't wait for an answer. He tightened his grip on her arm, took a single, powerful step, and launched them both out into the empty air. For a breathtaking second, there was nothing. No floor, no train, just the violent rush of wind and the dizzying sensation of falling. Ellie squeezed her eyes shut. A silent scream trapped in her throat. She felt Silas's arm around her, pulling her tight against his side, turning in midair to position his larger body to take the worst of the impact. Then they hit the ground. It was not a landing, it was a crash. The world became a violent, scraping, tumbling chaos of pain and noise. Gravel tore at their clothes and skin. The hard, sun-baked earth slammed into them, knocking the wind from their lungs in a collective gasp. They rolled, over and over, down the steep embankment alongside the tracks, a tangled mess of limbs and dusty canvas. Finally, their momentum spent. They came to a stop in a shallow ditch at the bottom of the slope, hidden from the tracks by a thicket of creosote bushes. The train, with its shouting men, was already receding, its rhythmic clatter growing fainter with every second. It didn't stop. It couldn't. It was an uncaring machine, and their small, desperate drama was nothing to it. For a long moment, there was only the sound of their own ragged, painful breathing and the soft whisper of the desert wind. Ellie lay on her back, staring up at the vast, empty sky, every inch of her body screaming in protest. Her arms and legs were scraped raw, and a sharp pain pulsed in her shoulder. Dust filled her mouth and nose. Beside her, Silas pushed himself onto his elbows, his movements stiff and deliberate. His duster was torn, and a trickle of blood ran from a cut on his temple, tracing a dark line through the grime on his face. He ignored it. His first act was to look at Ellie, his eyes quickly scanning her for serious injury. His second was to look back toward the tracks. The train was now just a black line in the distance, its smoke a smudge against the horizon. They were alone. He pushed himself to his feet, wincing as he put weight on his leg. He reached down a hand to Ellie. It was the same hand that had held his gun, the same hand that had pulled her from the train large, calloused, and covered in a fine layer of dust and blood. "We have to move," he said, his voice strained but firm. "They might stop the train up ahead, or they might not. Either way, we can't stay here." Ellie looked at his outstretched hand. It was steady. It was real. She took it, and his strong fingers closed around hers, pulling her to her feet. She swayed, dizzy and battered, but she stood. Together, two strangers bound by a desperate leap. They turned their backs on the iron rails and began to stumble away, deeper into the vast, silent, and unforgiving heart of the desert. The desert was a furnace, and they were two embers walking through the heart of the flame. The sun, a merciless white eye in the sky, beat down on them, stealing the moisture from their breath before they could exhale. Every step was an effort. The ground was a treacherous mix of sharp rock and shifting sand that seemed determined to pull them down. For Ellie, the world had shrunk to the simple, agonizing rhythm of placing one bruised foot in front of the other. Her shoulder throbbed with a deep, insistent ache, and the scrapes on her arms and legs burned as if touched by a hot poker. Silas walked ahead of her, a slow, unhurried pace that somehow devoured the miles. He moved with the economy of a man who knew that wasted energy was a death sentence in this land. He did not speak, offered no words of comfort or encouragement. His silence was as vast and profound as the landscape around them. Yet, it was not an empty silence. He would pause, his head lifting slightly as he scanned the horizon, reading the subtle language of the terrain, the dip in the land that might suggest a dry wash, the line of hardy green that hinted at a stubborn underground spring. He was a part of this place, and Ellie, stumbling behind him, was a trespasser he had taken under his wing. Hours bled into one another. The sun climbed to its zenith, then began its slow descent toward the jagged teeth of the western mountains. Thirst was a physical presence now, a rasp in Ellie's throat and a thickness on her tongue. Just when she felt she could go no further, that she would simply lie down and let the desert claim her, Silas stopped. He had led them to a shallow, rocky overhang, a small pocket of shade that offered meager respite from the relentless sun. From a leather pouch on his belt, He produced a small canteen. He uncapped it and handed it to her without a word. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it was the most precious thing she had ever known. She took a small sip, then another, forcing herself to stop before she drank it all. She handed it back to him. He took only a brief swallow before capping it and returning it to his belt. They sat in the sliver of shade, the silence broken only by the abrasive whisper of the wind over the rocks. He asked no questions. He did not ask her name, nor why 3 men were chasing her. He simply sat, his stormy eyes watching the trail they had made, a silent sentinel. And in his quiet presence, a strange and unfamiliar feeling began to take root in Ellie's exhausted soul, the feeling of being safe. They walked on as the shadows grew long, the heat finally beginning to relent. The landscape began to change, the flat, unforgiving plains giving way to rolling foothills. Silas led them through a narrow canyon, its high rock walls echoing the sound of their weary footsteps. When they emerged on the other side, he stopped and pointed. Below them, nestled in the protective embrace of a wide, shallow valley, was a place that did not seem to belong to the harsh world around it. It was a homestead, a small, sturdy-looking cabin built of thick, dark logs sat beside a larger, weather-beaten barn. A crooked line of fencing enclosed a patch of earth where rows of corn stood, their green a shocking splash of life against the muted browns and grays of the surrounding land. A stone well and a lone, gnarled cottonwood tree completed the picture. The place was not beautiful or grand. It was stark, isolated, and had the look of something that had been built to endure, not to please the eye. It looked like the man who stood beside her. It was a stubborn fist clenched against the desert. "My place," Silas said. The 2 words were the longest sentence he had spoken all day. As they drew closer, a movement near the barn caught Ellie's eye. It was not an animal, but it moved with a similar caution. A figure, small and wiry, darted from behind a water trough and peered at them. It was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, with a wild thatch of sun-bleached hair that fell into his eyes. He was barefoot, clad only in a pair of patched, oversized trousers held up by a piece of rope. His face was smudged with dirt, and his eyes, wide and startlingly blue, were fixed on them with the wary intensity of a hawk. The boy did not run to greet them. He stood his ground, a small, feral creature assessing a potential threat. Silas gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod in the boy's direction. The boy, after a moment's hesitation, mirrored the gesture, a flicker of acknowledgement passing between them. He then turned and, with the same swift, silent grace, disappeared back behind the barn. "That's Tom," Silas said, by way of explanation. The inside of the cabin was as simple and unadorned as the outside. It was a single room, dominated by a large stone fireplace that served for both warmth and cooking. A rough-hewn table with 2 benches stood in the center. In one corner was a bed, neatly made, and in another, a smaller cot. The air smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and coffee. Everything was worn, but everything was clean and in its place. It was a space of quiet, masculine order. Silas gestured to the smaller cot. "You can take that." He then went to the fireplace, stoking the embers and adding a few pieces of wood. He moved with a familiar, practiced ease, his large frame navigating the small space without a single wasted motion. Ellie stood uncertainly in the middle of the room, feeling like a stray dog brought in from the rain. Her body ached, her dress was in tatters, and she was caked in a layer of dust and sweat. She felt entirely out of place in this clean, quiet world. Silas seemed to sense her discomfort. He went to a bucket by the door, ladled some water into a basin, and set it on the table with a clean, folded rag beside it. He did not look at her as he did it. It was another offering, another silent act of kindness that spoke volumes more than words ever could. That night, for the first time in many nights, Ellie slept without fear. She was exhausted, but it was a physical exhaustion, not the soul-deep weariness of terror. She curled up on the cot, the unfamiliar but not unpleasant scent of wood smoke around her, and listened to the steady, quiet breathing of the man on the other side of the room. He was a stranger, a man who had pulled her into his life with a single gesture, but she felt safer with him than she had ever felt with her own kin. She woke the next morning to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Silas was already up. Standing by the fire, Tom, the wild child, was sitting at the table, his bare feet hooked on the bench rung, watching Silas with those same intense, hawk-like eyes. He glanced at Ellie as she sat up, his expression unreadable, before turning his attention back to the promise of breakfast. They ate in silence. It was a comfortable silence, not an awkward one. It was the silence of people who understood that the morning was a time for quiet reflection, not for idle chatter. Silas placed a plate with bacon and a piece of hardtack in front of her. Tom ate quickly and efficiently, his eyes darting from his plate to the door, as if constantly ready to flee. When he was finished, he slid off the bench, gave Silas another one of his fleeting nods, and slipped out the door as quietly as he had entered. After the meal, Silas took a rifle from the wall, checked its action, and slung a pouch over his shoulder. "I'll be back before sundown," he said, looking not at her, but at the door. "There's water in the bucket, food in the pantry. Tom won't bother you." And then he was gone. Ellie was left alone in the quiet cabin. For a moment, a flicker of the old panic returned. She was alone, in a strange place, with no idea where she was, but it quickly faded. This place felt different. She looked around the small room. A broom made of bound twigs leaned against the wall. The floor was dusty from their arrival the day before. The plates from their breakfast sat on the table. She did not make a conscious decision. Her body simply began to move. She picked up the broom and began to sweep, the rhythmic whisking sound a comforting, domestic noise in the silence. She swept the dust and the tracked-in dirt out the open door. She washed the plates and set them to dry. She found the pantry, a small closet stocked with sacks of flour, beans, and salted meat, and she took out some beans to soak for their evening meal. She worked all day. She found a patch of stubborn vegetables growing near the cornfield and pulled a few carrots and an onion. She fetched water from the well, the rope rough against her scraped hands, the bucket heavy. She saw Tom a few times, a fleeting shadow at the edge of the woods, watching her. He never came close, but she felt his eyes on her. He was a guardian of this place, as silent and watchful as the man who had raised him. When Silas returned at dusk, carrying 2 rabbits, he stopped in the doorway. He took in the swept floor, the clean table, the pot of beans simmering over the fire, sending a warm, savory smell through the cabin. He looked at Ellie, who was mending a tear in her dress with a needle and thread she had found in a small wooden box. He said nothing, but his eyes, for just a fraction of a second, seemed to soften. He simply nodded, the same brief acknowledging gesture he gave the boy, and went to skin the rabbits. And so, a routine was born, unspoken and unnegotiated. Each day, Silas would leave to hunt or check his trap lines or work on some unseen corner of the homestead. And each day, Ellie would work. She cooked and cleaned and tended the small garden. She learned the rhythms of the place, the way the sun fell across the valley floor, the time of day the wind picked up, the soft coo of the doves that roosted in the cottonwood tree. Tom, slowly, began to accept her presence. He would leave small gifts for her on the cabin steps, a shiny rock, a bird's feather, a handful of wild berries. He never stayed to be thanked. They were silent offerings, his own way of speaking. One afternoon, she was humming a tune her mother used to sing while she patched one of Silas's shirts. She looked up to see Tom standing in the doorway, listening, his head cocked to one side like a curious bird. He didn't run away. No one spoke of the future. No one spoke of the past. Words were a currency they did not trade in. Their language was one of action. It was the language of a bowl of hot stew left on the hearth for a man returning late and cold. It was the language of a broken fence post mended, a loose shutter fixed. It was the quiet understanding that grew in the space between them. A bond forged not in declarations of love or passion, but in the shared, simple, profound act of living. It was the shared meal at the end of a long day, the three of them at the table, the lantern casting a warm, golden glow on their faces, a small, unlikely family in the heart of a vast and lonely wilderness. Ellie, the girl who had been running for her life, had stumbled into a life she never knew she wanted, a quiet haven built on silent nods and shared suppers. The passage of time in the valley was marked not by a calendar, but by the sun's slow march across the sky and the subtle shifts in the desert's breath. Weeks turned into a month, then two. The fierce white heat of summer began to yield, ever so slightly, to the golden, gentler warmth of early autumn. The corn in the small field turned from green to a pale, dry gold, and the leaves of the lone cottonwood tree began to whisper with a new, papery rustle. Ellie's physical wounds had healed, the angry red scrapes from their fall fading into pale, silvery scars on her skin. The healing of her spirit was a slower, more delicate process, happening so quietly she was barely aware of it herself. The homestead had become her entire world, a sanctuary walled in by the silent, watchful mountains. The simple, repetitive tasks that filled her days were a balm to her frayed nerves. The rhythmic scrubbing of the floorboards, the kneading of dough for their daily bread, the careful tending of the small vegetable patch, these were honest, grounding labors. They left no room for the ghosts of the past to crowd in. She grew to know the weight of the water bucket, the feel of the worn broom handle in her hands, the specific creak of the cabin's third floorboard. These small, physical certainties were anchors in the turbulent waters of her memory. Her relationship with the homestead's other inhabitants remained one of profound silence. Tom, the wild boy, had accepted her presence. He no longer watched her from a distance, but would sometimes sit on the cabin steps while she worked, sharpening a stick with a piece of flint or meticulously arranging a line of pebbles. He never spoke to her, but one afternoon, she found he had repaired a small hole in her foraging basket with surprising skill, weaving strips of yucca fiber into the damaged wicker. It was his way of saying, "You belong here." And then there was Silas. He remained an enigma, a man as vast and quiet as the land he inhabited. She learned his habits, the way he drank his coffee black and scalding hot in the morning, the focused stillness that came over him when he cleaned his rifle, the slight limp in his left leg that was more pronounced at the end of a long day. He was a man of immense capability. She saw him reshoe his own horse, build a new gate for the corral with nothing but an axe and an auger, and track a wounded deer for a full day, returning with meat that would feed them for a week. He never ever touched her. It was a fact that Ellie became acutely aware of when they worked together, mending a section of fence or stacking firewood. He moved with a deliberate, careful grace, always maintaining a sliver of distance between them. If he handed her a tool, he would place it on a surface for her to pick up, his fingers never brushing against hers. When they sat at the table for their evening meal, he ensured there was always a respectable space on the bench. At first, she thought it was disapproval, a quiet judgment on the strange, ragged woman who had appeared in his life. But as time went on, she began to understand it differently. It was not a rejection. It was a courtesy. It was a wall of respect he had built around her, a space for her to breathe. One evening, after a particularly long day of harvesting the last of the corn, they sat at the table while a pot of rabbit stew simmered on the fire. Tom was already asleep on his cot, his small form a motionless lump under a thin blanket. The only light came from a single lantern which cast long, dancing shadows on the log walls and threw a warm, intimate glow on the table between them. Silas was carefully oiling the leather of a bridle, his large hands surprisingly deft as he worked the conditioner into the worn straps. Ellie was mending one of Tom's shirts, her needle moving in a steady, practiced rhythm. The silence was comfortable. filled with the soft sounds of her stitching and the slick slide of the oiled rag in Silas's hands. A sense of peace settled over her, a feeling so foreign she almost didn't recognize it. It was in this moment of unguarded tranquility that it happened. Silas reached across the table for a small awl that lay near her sewing basket. He wasn't looking. His attention focused on a stubborn buckle on the bridle. His hand, large and calloused, brushed against the back of hers as he reached for the tool. The contact was feather-light, accidental, and over in an instant, but for Ellie, it was like a lightning strike. A violent, full-body flinch racked her frame. She gasped, a sharp, strangled sound, and snatched her hand back as if she'd been burned, the sewing basket tumbling from her lap and spilling its contents across the floor. She stared down at her own hand, now trembling uncontrollably, her heart hammering against her ribs. The ghosts she held at bay during the day came rushing back in the lantern light, their whispers loud and terrifying in her ears. Silas froze, his hand hovering in midair. He slowly retracted it, his eyes lifting from the bridle to her face. He saw not anger or annoyance, but a raw, primal terror that had stripped all the color from her cheeks. Her eyes were wide with a remembered horror, and she was breathing in shallow, panicked little sips of air. He said nothing. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable but for a deep, furrowed line that appeared between his brows. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not try to offer a clumsy apology. He just waited, his stillness once again a silent anchor, giving her the space to find her way back from whatever dark place his accidental touch had sent her. Slowly, painfully, Ellie's breathing began to even out. The trembling in her hand subsided to a fine tremor. She stared at the spools of thread and buttons scattered on the floor, ashamed of her own violent reaction. She owed this man an explanation. He had saved her, sheltered her, and treated her with more decency than any man she had ever known. He deserved to know why his touch was a terror to her. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice hoarse and shaky. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. She began to speak, the words coming out in a halting, broken stream, as if she were pulling them one by one from a deep, painful well. I've never. No man has ever touched me before." She risked a glance at him. He hadn't moved. He was just listening, his full, solemn attention on her. Not in kindness. Anyway, she amended, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "I grew up with my father. My mother died when I was young. He wasn't a strong man. He liked to drink, and he liked to gamble. He lost our farm, piece by piece." She took a shaky breath, the memories unspooling. "A man came to collect a debt, Mr. Gable. He owns the saloon in Dusty Creek, the town I left. A big man, with wet lips and eyes that looked at you like you were already on his plate. My father, he had nothing left to give him. No money, no land." She paused, the next words the hardest of all. "So he gave him me." The silence in the cabin was absolute, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire. Silas had stopped his work with the bridle. His hands were still on the table, but they were no longer relaxed. They were clenched into tight, white-knuckled fists. "It was an arrangement," Ellie continued, her voice flat, devoid of emotion as she recounted the horror. "Mr. Gable would forgive my father's debt, and I was to be his wife. That's what they called it. Wife." The word was a bitter mockery. The wedding was set for a week later, but it was all a sham. "I wasn't to be a wife, Mr. Gable explained my duties to me himself. He said a saloon keeper's wife had to be a good hostess. She had to keep the men happy, keep them drinking, keep them coming back. He said I would be the prettiest attraction he'd ever had, a flower for all his customers to admire." She finally looked up and met Silas's gaze. His eyes were like chips of granite, hard and cold with an emotion she couldn't name. It looked like fury. "He said that a man who bought a ticket could enjoy the show. I was never to refuse a drink with a customer, or a dance, or whatever else a paying man might request. "He was my husband," he said, "and his property was his to do with as he pleased." She saw something flicker in Silas's eyes, a dangerous, violent spark that made her stomach clench. But his voice, when he finally spoke, was low and steady, a controlled rumble. "The men on the train." Ellie nodded, dropping her gaze back to her lap. They worked for him. Jebediah was his right hand, Mr. Gable sent them to bring his property back. She wrapped her arms around herself, a coldness seeping into her bones that had nothing to do with the night air. The night before, the wedding. "I couldn't do it. I couldn't let that be my life. I waited until my father was passed out from drink. I took what little money he had left, $30 and some change, and I ran. I just ran. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away." The story was finished. The ugly, shameful secret was out, lying in the warm lantern light between them. For a long time, the only sound was the fire. Ellie waited for the disgust, the pity, the judgment. She waited for him to tell her to leave, to cast her out now that he knew what kind of damaged, tainted goods she was. But Silas did none of those things. He rose slowly from the table, his chair scraping softly on the wooden floor. He walked to the fire, took the poker, and gently stoked the flames, sending a shower of bright orange sparks up the chimney. He added another log, the wood settling with a soft thud. He was making the room warmer, chasing away the chill. Then he went to the coffee pot that was always kept warm on the hearth, poured a tin cupful, and placed it on the table in front of her. He sat back down. He looked at her, and the fury was gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep, quiet solemnity. "He won't find you here," he said. It was not a guess. It was a promise, a vow. And in that moment, Ellie understood. She understood his silence, his distance, his careful respect for her space. He hadn't been judging her. He had been protecting her. He had seen the terror in her that first day on the train and had known, with some deep, instinctual wisdom, that she was a creature who had been brutalized by the world, and that the only thing she needed was a safe place to land. He had given her that, without question and without expectation. A single tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. It was not a tear of sadness or of fear. It was a tear of profound, overwhelming relief. For the first time in her life, she felt like a person, not a price tag. She was not a debt to be paid or a piece of property to be reclaimed. In the quiet, steady gaze of this silent, solitary man, she was just Ellie, and for the first time, that felt like it was enough. The confession, once spoken, did not shatter the quiet world of the homestead. It settled into it, becoming another layer of the silence, but a different kind. Before, the silence had been one of caution and uncertainty. Now, it was a silence of understanding, by sharing the ugliest part of her life. Ellie had handed Silas a fragile, broken piece of her soul. He had not dropped it. He had simply held it, acknowledged its weight, and then, with his actions, began to show her how to mend it. Words did not become more common between them. Silas was not a man who could be changed by a single conversation. His nature was forged in solitude and the hard truths of the wilderness, where talk was cheap and often useless. But his silence, which had once seemed a formidable wall, now felt like a deep, still pool of water. It was not empty. It was full of unspoken things. His language was not of the tongue, but of the hands, of quiet foresight, of small, deliberate acts that spoke a profound and unwavering truth. You are safe here. You are valued here. Ellie's days continued in their familiar rhythm, but she began to notice things she hadn't seen before. She became a student of this silent language, learning its grammar and its nuances. She had a favorite spot where she would rest for a few minutes in the afternoon, a flat-topped boulder under the shade of the cottonwood tree that overlooked the valley. The stone was rough and often uncomfortably hot from the lingering sun. One afternoon, she arrived at her spot to find a small, perfectly cut square of thick, supple leather lying on the rock's surface. It was a piece of scrap from his saddlery work, smooth and cool to the touch. He had not mentioned it. He had not presented it to her. He had simply seen a small, unspoken discomfort and provided a solution. She sat on the leather. The barrier between her and the hard stone a small but significant comfort, and felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the sun. The well was a good 50 yards from the cabin door, and hauling 2 full buckets of water was the most strenuous of her daily chores. She often returned to the cabin breathless and thirsty, her hands raw from the rope. It became a habit. As she set the heavy buckets down just inside the door, she would find a tin cup of cool water waiting for her on the edge of the table. It was always there, drawn fresh from the first bucket he pulled in the morning and kept in the shade. He was often out of the cabin when she returned. Yet his foresight was always waiting for her. The first time she saw it, she paused, her hand hovering over the cup. It was such a simple thing, a cup of water, but it was a cup of water that said, "I know your thirst, I know your labor. Let me ease it." She drank it slowly, and the water soothed more than just her dry throat. His care extended to the boy, and by watching him with Tom, Ellie learned even more about the heart of this quiet man. Tom was still a wild thing, but under Silas's patient guidance, he was slowly learning the ways of men. Silas never raised his voice to the boy. He taught by showing. When he taught Tom how to set a snare, he didn't just give orders. He guided the boy's small, clumsy hands with his own large ones, showing him how to feel the tension in the cord, how to find the perfect spot on the game trail. When Tom made a mistake, Silas would simply reset the snare and have him try again, his patience as boundless as the sky. He was teaching the boy not just how to survive, but how to be capable, how to be gentle and strong at the same time. He was giving Tom the fathering that Ellie, in her own way, was just now beginning to understand. In this atmosphere of quiet consideration, Ellie began to unfurl like a desert flower after a rare rain. The constant, gnawing fear that had been her companion for so long began to recede, replaced by a tentative sense of peace. She started to see the beauty in the harsh landscape she had once only feared. She noticed the way the setting sun painted the western cliffs in fiery shades of orange and purple, the delicate resilience of the tiny purple wildflowers that grew in the cracks between the rocks, the vast, silent congregation of stars that blazed in the night sky. One morning, on her way back from the vegetable patch, she saw a particularly vibrant patch of Indian paintbrush, their scarlet tips a bold slash of color against the dusty earth. On an impulse she didn't fully understand, she picked a single, perfect stalk. She carried it back to the cabin, its brilliant color a stark contrast to her own drab, mended dress. She felt a sudden shyness. It was a frivolous, useless thing, a spot of beauty in a world dedicated to practical survival. Unsure of what to do with it, she simply tucked the stem into a crack in the rough-hewn timber of the porch steps and went inside. She thought no more of it. It was a small, fleeting gesture. The desert winds would surely claim it by nightfall. The next evening, Silas was sitting at the table, working in a small, leather-bound ledger. It was a book she had seen him with before, where he seemed to keep notes on the seasons, on supplies, on the slow and steady business of homesteading. He looked up as she came in from securing the chicken coop for the night, and their eyes met for a moment. He gave her his customary slight nod and returned to his work. As she began to prepare their supper, she glanced over his shoulder. There, pressed carefully between the pages of his ledger, was the stalk of Indian paintbrush. It lay flat against the paper, its vibrant color preserved, a line of scarlet ink drawn by nature's hand. He had seen her small offering. He had not just seen it, he had understood it. He had taken her fleeting moment of beauty and made it permanent, given it a place among the important, practical records of his life. He was saying, in his silent way, "I see the beauty you see. It matters." Ellie turned back to the fire, her heart doing a slow, painful flip in her chest. A blush rose to her cheeks, and she was grateful for the dim light of the cabin. It was the most intimate exchange she had ever had with a man. This silent conversation about a wildflower. It was more real, more profound than any of the flowery, false promises she had overheard men make in her father's presence. Her growing affection began to express itself in her own silent actions. She learned exactly how he liked his coffee, and made sure the pot was always on the fire when he came in from the cold. She saw the way he rubbed his shoulder after a long day of chopping wood, and she began to prepare a hot poultice of herbs, leaving it by the fire for him without a word. When she mended his shirts, she took extra care, her stitches small and even, a quiet testament to her growing devotion. She would watch him from the cabin door as he worked, his powerful frame moving with a steady, reassuring rhythm, and a feeling would swell within her that was so large and so new. She didn't have a name for it. One afternoon, he was repairing the handle of an axe, holding the heavy head steady while he meticulously shaped a new hickory handle with a draw knife. Tom sat nearby, watching with his usual rapt attention. Ellie brought them both a cup of water. As she handed the cup to Silas, her fingers brushed against his. This time, she did not flinch. The contact was brief, a fleeting warmth, but it sent a jolt through her that was not of fear, but of a startling, terrifying, and wonderful new awareness. His skin was rough, calloused from a lifetime of hard labor, but there was a warmth to it, a life to it, that felt right. He paused in his work, his gaze lifting to meet hers. His eyes, usually so guarded, seemed to hold a question. He saw that she hadn't pulled away. He saw the color rise in her cheeks. He saw the slight parting of her lips. He did not smile, but the hard line of his mouth seemed to soften almost imperceptibly. He held her gaze for a heartbeat longer than was necessary, a silent acknowledgement of the moment that had just passed between them. Then he took the cup, drank the water, and returned to his work. Nothing had been said. Nothing had been confessed. But everything had changed. The wall of respectful distance had been breached, not by force, but by the slow, patient erosion of 1,000 tiny, unspoken kindnesses. They were no longer just a man, a woman, and a boy surviving together. They were something more. They were 3 solitary souls who had, against all odds, begun to weave themselves into the fabric of a family, using the silent, sturdy threads of action, of care, of a wildflower pressed between the pages of a book. The peace of the valley was a fragile, precious thing, and it was shattered in the late afternoon by a sound that did not belong. It was not the gentle nicker of Silas's horse or the rustle of wind through the dry cornstalks. It was the frantic, percussive drumming of multiple horses' hooves, ridden hard and fast, their sound swallowed and then spat out by the canyon walls. It was the sound of an invasion. Ellie was by the well, drawing the last bucket of water for the evening. When she heard it, she froze, the wet rope slack in her hands, her head lifting like a frightened deer. In the corral, Silas, who had been checking a loose shoe on his horse, went utterly still. He didn't look towards the sound. He looked at the cabin, where Tom was sitting on the steps, carving a piece of wood. "Tom?" Silas's voice was low, calm, but it cut through the air with an authority that made the boy's head snap up. "Inside, now." Tom didn't ask why. He had learned to obey that tone without question. He scrambled inside, his small wooden bird forgotten on the steps. Silas dropped the horse's hoof and began to walk, not with haste, but with a deadly, deliberate purpose, toward the center of the yard. He moved to place himself directly between the oncoming sound and the cabin door. Ellie's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She knew, with a certainty that was as cold and sharp as ice. Who was coming? She abandoned the water bucket and ran for the cabin, her feet stumbling on the uneven ground. She slipped through the door just as the riders burst into the clearing. It was them, Jebediah, Finn, and the third, hulking man whose name she didn't know. They were dustier, leaner, and their faces were masks of grim determination. They pulled their horses to a skidding halt, the animals snorting and stamping, their eyes wild. The homestead, which had been a haven of peace moments before, was suddenly crowded, charged with a palpable, violent tension. Jebediah swung down from his saddle, his boots thudding into the dirt. A cruel smile twisted his lips beneath his greasy mustache as his eyes landed on Ellie, framed in the cabin doorway. Well, look what the buzzards didn't get. Told you she'd find a hole to crawl into. Finn, looking even more weaselly than she remembered, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Looks like she found a big one, he sneered, his eyes flicking over Silas's broad frame. Silas stood motionless, his hands loose at his sides. He looked like a mountain that had decided to grow in the middle of their path. "This is private land," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You've got no business here. Ride out." Jebediah chuckled, a sound like gravel turning in a bucket. He took a step forward, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Oh, I think we do have business here. We've come for what we're owed. Mr. Gable is a patient man, but his property has been missing for a long time, and we're here to collect on his investment." He looked past Silas, directly at Ellie. "That includes the $30 that don't belong to you. Girly." So that was it. Not just her, but the money. The small, pathetic sum she had stolen to buy her freedom. It was all a matter of business. "She's not going anywhere," Silas said. The words were flat, absolute. It was not a debate. It was a statement of fact. "Is that so?" Jebediah's smile vanished. "It's one of you, and three of us." "Old man, I don't much like those odds for you." He drew his pistol. "Now, you can step aside, and we'll just take the girl and be on our way. Or you can die here, in the dirt, for something that ain't your concern." Inside the cabin, Ellie grabbed Tom's small, trembling hand. "Stay behind me," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. She peered through a crack in the door, her body rigid with a terror so profound it threatened to swallow her whole. This was her fault. She had brought this plague upon this quiet, peaceful man. She watched as Silas slowly, deliberately, began to raise his hands, a sign of surrender. Jebediah's grin returned, but it was a trick. As his hands reached shoulder height, Silas exploded into motion. In a blur, his right hand shot out, not for a gun, but for a heavy wooden fence post that was leaning against the corral. He ripped it from the ground and swung it in a brutal, sweeping arc. The heavy timber connected with Jebediah's gun hand with a sickening crack of bone. The pistol flew from his grasp, and he roared in pain, staggering back. Before Finn or the other man could react, Silas was on them. He was not a gunman fighting a duel. He was a force of nature, a bear defending its territory. He moved with a brutal efficiency, his fists like hammers, the fence post a whirlwind of destruction. He drove the brute backward with a powerful shove, then brought the post down on Finn's shoulder, sending the smaller man sprawling in the dirt. The yard erupted into a chaotic, desperate brawl. It was not the clean, decisive violence of a shootout. It was ugly, close, and personal. Jebediah, clutching his broken hand, screamed at his men, his voice a high-pitched shriek of fury and pain. The brute, recovering his balance, charged Silas, and the two large men crashed together with the force of colliding bulls. They wrestled in the dust, trading heavy, breathless blows. Finn, scrambling to his feet, saw the cabin door and an idea lit his beady eyes. While Silas was occupied, he made a dash for the cabin. Ellie saw him coming and slammed the heavy door shut, dropping the thick wooden bar into place just as he crashed against it. The wood groaned under the impact. "Open this door, you witch," he shrieked, pounding on it with his fists. Inside, the cabin was a trap. Tom was crying now, silent tears streaming down his dirt-streaked face. Ellie backed away from the door, pulling Tom with her, her eyes darting around for a weapon, for an escape. The single room felt like a coffin. The pounding stopped. A moment of silence. Then the sound of shattering glass. Finn had smashed one of the small windows. He reached through, fumbling for the bar on the door. Ellie grabbed the iron fireplace poker, her hands shaking, and swung it wildly at his arm. He yelped and pulled his hand back, but it was too late. He had lifted the bar. The door flew open. Finn stumbled in, a wild look in his eyes, a long, ugly cut on his forearm from the broken glass. He saw Ellie and Tom cowering in the corner, and a malicious grin spread across his face. Nowhere left to run. He hissed. Outside, the fight raged. Ellie could hear grunts of pain, the thud of fists on flesh, the splintering of wood. She knew Silas couldn't hold them off forever. Finn lunged for her, but she dodged, pushing Tom behind the large wooden table. The cabin became a scene of frantic, desperate chaos. Finn overturned the table, sending their tin plates and cups crashing to the floor. He was between her and the door, his eyes fixed on Tom. "Give me the boy," he snarled. "You give me the boy, and maybe Jebediah will go easy on you." "No," Ellie screamed, her voice raw with terror and a fury she didn't know she possessed. But Finn was quicker. He feinted towards her, and as she flinched back, he dove past her and grabbed Tom. He dragged the boy, kicking and struggling, into the center of the room, and pulled a long, wicked-looking knife from his belt. He wrapped one arm around Tom's chest and pressed the flat of the cold blade against the boy's throat. Tom froze. A choked sob caught in his chest. "That's enough!" Finn screamed, his voice cracking. The sound carried out into the yard. The noise of the fight outside stopped. Silas and the two other men, all breathing heavily, their faces bruised and bloody, turned to look at the scene framed in the cabin doorway. Silas's face was a mask of cold, deadly rage. Jebediah, cradling his broken hand, had a look of triumphant cruelty. "Looks like we got the winning hand now, old man," Jebediah called out, a pained wheeze in his voice. "You drop whatever you're holding, or the boy gets his throat cut." Silas was holding a piece of a broken wagon wheel, slowly, his eyes never leaving the knife at Tom's throat. He let it fall to the dust. Ellie's world narrowed to a single, terrifying point, the glint of lantern light on the steel blade pressed against the pale, fragile skin of Tom's neck. The boy she had come to see as a little brother, the silent child who left her gifts of feathers and stones. All her fear, all her history of being a victim, coalesced into a single, white-hot point of rage. Her eyes darted around the room and landed on the wall next to the fireplace. There, on its wooden pegs, rested Silas's rifle, a long, heavy Winchester. She had seen him clean it a dozen times, but she had never touched it. The thought of firing it was as alien as the thought of flying. But the knife was at Tom's throat. In that moment, the timid, fleeing girl who had hidden under a man's coat on a train ceased to exist. She moved. It was not a thought, but a pure, primal instinct. She launched herself across the room, grabbed the heavy rifle from the wall, and turned. It was heavier than she could have imagined. The wooden stock felt awkward and clumsy in her hands. She fumbled with the hammer, her thumb slipping twice before she managed to cock it with a loud, metallic click. Finn's eyes widened in disbelief, then narrowed. "You wouldn't," he sneered, pressing the knife a fraction closer to Tom. "You ain't got the nerve." He was wrong. She did not have nerve. She had terror and love, and that was far more powerful. She lifted the rifle, the long barrel wavering wildly. She tried to aim, but her hands were shaking so violently she couldn't keep the sight steady. Tears of rage and fear blurred her vision. She could see Tom's wide, terrified blue eyes fixed on her. She squeezed her eyes shut, pointed the barrel in Finn's direction, and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space of the cabin. It was a physical blow, a roar of sound and force that slammed into her, making her stagger back. The smell of sulfur and burnt powder filled the air. A strangled scream of pain answered the blast. Ellie opened her eyes. Finn had released Tom and was clutching his own shoulder, where a dark, ugly stain was spreading rapidly across his shirt. The knife had clattered to the floor. Tom, released from the hold, scrambled away, seeking refuge behind the overturned table. The shot changed everything. The stalemate was broken. Jebediah and the brute were momentarily stunned by the unexpected resistance. In that split second of hesitation, Silas charged. He moved with a terrifying speed, ignoring the brute and going straight for Jebediah. But as he lunged, the brute recovered and swung a heavy, broken chair leg he'd picked up. He didn't aim, he just swung. The wood connected with the side of Silas's head with a sickening, wet thud. Silas's eyes went vacant. His momentum carried him forward a few more steps before his knees buckled, and he collapsed face down in the dirt, motionless. Silas Ellie's scream was a raw, ragged sound of pure anguish. Jebediah, seeing his opportunity, scooped up his fallen pistol with his good hand. He pointed it at the cabin, his face contorted in a mask of pain and fury. But he hesitated. Finn was bleeding badly, moaning on the floor. The woman, who he had assumed was a helpless victim, was standing in the doorway with a rifle in her hands, a wild, cornered look in her eyes. This wasn't the easy job he'd planned. "Get him up," he snarled at the brute. "We're leaving." The brute hesitated, looking at Silas's still form, then back at his boss. He grabbed the whimpering Finn, hauled him to his feet, and half-dragged, half-carried him toward the horses. Jebediah backed away slowly, his pistol still trained on Ellie. He mounted his horse, never taking his eyes off her, then wheeled the animal around and spurred it into a gallop. The brute threw Finn over his saddle and followed. Within seconds, they were gone, the sound of their frantic retreat fading back into the canyon. Silence descended. It was a heavy, ringing silence, thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. The homestead was a wreck. The yard was a mess of broken wood and churned-up dust. The cabin was in shambles. Tom was sobbing quietly from behind the table. But Ellie saw none of it. She dropped the heavy rifle. Its purpose served, and ran from the cabin. She fell to her knees in the dirt beside Silas. "Silas," she whispered, her voice trembling. She gently rolled him over. His face was pale beneath the grime and bruises. His eyes were closed. A slow trickle of dark blood was leaking from a gash on his temple, matting his hair and staining the thirsty ground. He was breathing, but it was a shallow, ragged sound. The quiet, immovable man who had been her rock, her protector, her silent guardian, was gone. In his place was a vulnerable, broken man, and the vast, lonely wilderness suddenly felt like it was closing in on all sides. The world had shrunk to the size of a single, still body. All the vastness of the desert, the silent majesty of the mountains, the infinite canopy of the stars, none of it mattered. The only landscape Ellie saw was the pale, bruised face of the man lying motionless in the dirt. Her scream died in her throat, replaced by a surge of adrenaline so fierce it burned away her terror, leaving behind a core of cold, hard resolve. She could not lift him. The thought was a brief, panicked flicker. He was a man of substance and size, and she was a slip of a thing, her strength already spent. "Tom," she said, her voice sharp, cutting through the boy's terrified sobs. "Help me." Tom crept out from behind the overturned table, his eyes huge and swimming with tears, fixed on the blood matted in Silas's hair. He was just a child, but in this place, even children had to be strong. "We can't carry him," Ellie said, her mind working with a desperate clarity she had never known. "Get the blanket from his bed, and the 2 spare axe handles from the lean-to. Hurry." While Tom ran to obey, his small, bare feet flying over the chaotic yard, Ellie knelt beside Silas, with trembling fingers. She ripped a long strip from the hem of her already tattered dress and pressed it gently against the gash on his temple. The blood was sluggish but steady. It stained the makeshift bandage a dark, terrifying crimson. He was breathing. She repeated it to herself like a prayer, a mantra against the encroaching despair. He's breathing. He's breathing. Together, a woman and a boy. They performed a miracle of leverage and will. They rolled the unconscious man onto the thick wool blanket. They slid the long, smooth hickory handles underneath, creating a crude but effective travois. The journey of 50 yards from the yard to the cabin was an odyssey. They pulled, grunting with the effort, their feet slipping in the churned dust. The dead weight of him was immense, a physical testament to the strength that now lay dormant. They scraped and struggled and heaved, and finally, they got him inside, dragging him to his own bed in the corner of the wrecked room. Then the long vigil began. The outside world ceased to exist. Day and night blurred into a single, continuous twilight, measured only by the level of oil in the lantern and the state of the fire in the hearth. The first hours were a frantic battle against death. Ellie sent Tom to fetch bucket after bucket of clean, cool water from the well. She washed the blood and grime from Silas's face with a tenderness that was almost reverent. The gash was ugly, swollen and purpling at the edges. She had seen men in Dusty Creek with lesser injuries who had been taken by fever. With a deep, shuddering breath, she went to the small cupboard where he kept his supplies. She found his straight razor and a bottle of whiskey. Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the razor. She had never touched a man's face, not even her father's. Now, she was shaving away the hair around a bloody wound on a man who was a stranger, yet who had become her entire world. She cleaned the razor, then cleaned the wound with whiskey. Her teeth clenched as he groaned in his unconsciousness, his body flinching from the sting. She bandaged his head properly, tearing a clean strip from her own petticoat, sacrificing the last decent piece of clothing she owned without a second thought. Her life became a series of small, vital tasks, repeated in an endless loop. She kept a cool, damp cloth on his forehead, rinsing it and replacing it the moment it grew warm from his fevered skin. She kept the fire going, not for warmth, but to have a constant supply of hot water. She sat by his bed, watching the slow, shallow rise and fall of his chest. Her ears strained for every rasp, every change in the rhythm of his breathing. When Tom, his own fear a palpable presence in the small cabin, would fall asleep on his cot, Ellie would remain awake, a solitary guardian in the flickering lantern light. She learned the geography of his unconsciousness. There were periods of deep, unnerving stillness, where his breathing was so shallow she would lean in close, her own breath held until she could feel the faint warmth of his on her cheek. Then there were the fevers, where a dry, burning heat would radiate from his skin, and he would thrash in the throes of some unseen battle, muttering broken words and names she didn't recognize. In those moments, she would hold him down gently, her small hands on his broad shoulders, her voice a low, soothing murmur, trying to anchor him to the world. After 2 days, she realized he would die if he didn't have sustenance. She cooked a thin gruel of cornmeal and water, a tasteless, nourishing broth. The challenge was getting it into him. She would sit beside him, cradling his heavy head in her lap, and use the tip of a spoon to patiently, painstakingly, place tiny drops of the liquid onto his dry, cracked lips, hoping he would swallow. Sometimes he did. Sometimes the gruel would just run down his chin. She would wipe it away and try again. Her persistence was a quiet, ferocious thing, born not of duty, but of a desperate, terrifying affection. She was fighting for him. She was fighting for this life they had started to build, this fragile sanctuary in the wilderness. It was in the deep, silent hours of the third night that the words began to come. The cabin was still, save for the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind finding its way through the cracks in the log walls. He was quiet, his fever having broken for a time, his breathing a little deeper. She sat on the small stool beside his bed, her body a single, prolonged ache of exhaustion, her eyes gritty from lack of sleep. She watched his face in the soft light. The strong, hard lines of it softened now by vulnerability. And she began to talk, her voice a low, raw whisper meant only for him and the shadows. "You're a stubborn man, Silas Boone," she started, her fingers tracing the pattern on the worn blanket that covered him. "So stubborn. You have to wake up. Tom, he needs you. He tries to be brave, but he's just a boy. He watches the door all day, waiting for you to get up and walk through it." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "I need you." The admission was so quiet it was almost swallowed by the silence. It was a truth she hadn't even allowed herself to think until this moment. And saying it aloud made it terrifyingly real. "I was so scared," she continued, the words spilling out now. A confession whispered to a man who couldn't hear. "When he hit you, when you fell, I thought my own heart had stopped. It's a funny thing. My whole life, I've been afraid of men, afraid of their hands, their voices, their wants. All I've ever done is run from them." She looked at her own hands, twisting in her lap. They were no longer the hands of a frightened girl. They were red and raw from hauling water, calloused from work. And now, they were the hands that were trying to nurse a man back to life. "I've never kissed a man," she whispered, the secret a painful, shameful thing she had carried for so long. "Never even held a man's hand, not by choice. My father, he'd grab my arm, and it was a vice, Mr. Gable. His touch was like a slug crawling on my skin. I thought all men were like that. I thought that was what a man's touch was for to take, to own." She reached out, her hand trembling, and lightly touched the back of his hand where it lay, still and heavy, on the blanket. His skin was warm, dry. It was just skin. It was just a hand, but it was his hand, the hand that had pulled her from the train, the hand that had never once been laid on her in anger or demand. "But when you were lying out there," she said, her voice cracking, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a hot path down her cheek. "When you were lying in the dirt, bleeding, I was more afraid of losing you than I've ever been of anything in my whole life. More afraid than I was of Mr. Gable, more afraid than I was of that train. I didn't want to run. I just wanted you to open your eyes." She sat like that for a long time, her small hand resting on his, her quiet confession hanging in the warm, still air of the cabin. She had laid her soul bare, and her words, unheard, seemed to echo in the profound silence. Exhaustion finally claimed her, and she slumped forward, her head resting on the edge of the bed beside his arm, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. She awoke with a start. The light in the cabin had changed. A pale gray dawn was filtering through the dirty window pane. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. For a terrifying moment, she thought she had slept too long, that he had... She sat up, her heart pounding, and looked at him. His eyes were open. They were not clear. They were clouded with pain and confusion, but they were open, and they were looking at her. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. He tried to speak, but only a dry, rasping sound came from his throat. She quickly ladled a cup of water, and, supporting his head, she held it to his lips. He drank slowly, painfully. He sank back onto the pillow, his eyes closing for a moment, as if from the sheer effort. Ellie's heart was a wild, soaring thing. It was hope, so bright and sharp it almost hurt. She sat back on the stool, her hands clasped in her lap, not knowing what to do or say, now that the audience of her whispered confessions was awake. His eyes opened again. He looked at her, his gaze a little clearer this time. He seemed to take in her exhausted face, the dark circles under her eyes, her torn and stained dress. His gaze drifted down to her hands, clasped so tightly in her lap. Then, with an effort that seemed to cost him all the strength he had, he moved his own hand, inch by inch, across the blanket. It was a slow, arduous journey. She watched, her breath caught in her throat. His fingers, weak and trembling, brushed against hers. She did not pull away. She did not even breathe. He did not speak. He had no words. But he slowly, deliberately, curled his fingers around hers. His grip was weak, a shadow of its former strength. But it was unmistakable. It was not a grasp. It was an embrace. It was an answer. It was a thank you. It was, I heard you. It was stay. Ellie's tears came then. Not the hot tears of fear or the desperate tears of grief, but the quiet, cleansing tears of overwhelming relief. She laced her fingers through his, her hand covering his in a gesture of mutual comfort, of shared survival. In the quiet dawn of the broken cabin, two solitary people, a man who had forgotten how to speak of his heart and a woman who had never been allowed to, finally said everything they needed to say, without a single word. Healing is not a single event, but a slow, quiet tide. For Silas, it came in fits and starts, a stubborn battle waged in the quiet confines of the log cabin. The first time he sat up on his own, a wave of dizziness sent the cabin spinning, and he had to grip the edge of the bed, his knuckles white, until the world settled. Ellie was there instantly, a steadying hand on his shoulder, a cup of water at his lips. He hated the weakness. She could see it in the tight set of his jaw, in the frustration that clouded his gray eyes. He was a man accustomed to wresting a life from an unforgiving land, and being confined to a bed was a cage he did not bear gracefully. But he was also a man of immense patience, a trait honed by years of waiting for the seasons to turn and the game to show itself. He applied that same patience to his own body each day. He pushed a little further. First, it was sitting up, then standing, his hand braced against the log wall, his legs unsteady but determined. Then, a few slow, shuffling steps to the table, then to the door. Ellie watched him, her heart a painful mix of pride and anxiety. She never hovered, never offered a hand unless he faltered. She understood that this was a battle he had to fight for himself, a reclaiming of his own strength. Tom was a silent barometer of the cabin's emotional weather. During the worst of Silas's fever, the boy had been a ghost, moving silently, his eyes wide and fearful, as Silas began to heal. Tom's own tentative light returned. He started leaving his small gifts on the porch again, a strangely shaped stone, a hawk's feather. The day Silas first walked, unassisted, out into the sunlight and stood blinking on the porch, Tom, who had been hiding by the barn, let out a small, sharp whoop of joy before clapping a hand over his own mouth, as if startled by his own outburst. Silas heard it, a slow, faint smile, the first she had seen, touched his lips. The homestead bore the scars of the attack. It was a physical manifestation of their shared trauma. The yard was a mess of splintered wood and debris. The corral gate hung crookedly from a single leather hinge. The cabin window was boarded up with a piece of scrap wood, casting the interior in a perpetual gloom. The overturned table, the smashed crockery. Everything was a reminder of the violence that had shattered their peace. As Silas's strength returned, a new, unspoken rhythm established itself. It was the rhythm of rebuilding. The work was the medicine. It was the way they would heal the place, and in doing so, heal themselves. His first project was the corral gate. He spent a full day at it, his movements slow and deliberate, punctuated by long periods of rest. Ellie watched him from the cabin, her hands busy with her own work, but her attention always attuned to the sounds from the yard, the rhythmic rasp of his saw cutting through a new piece of timber, the solid, reassuring thud of a hammer driving wooden pegs into place. Each sound was a confirmation. He is getting stronger. We are getting safer. While he worked on the outside, she worked on the inside. She put the cabin back to rights with a fierce, determined energy. She swept away the last of the broken glass. She scrubbed the floorboards until they were pale and clean. She took every blanket, every piece of clothing, and washed it in the big trough, beating the dust and the memory of fear out of the fabric before hanging it in the sun to dry. She mended their clothes, her stitches tiny and precise, mending the tear in Silas's duster. She felt the thick, familiar canvas under her fingers, the fabric that had been her first sanctuary, and her stitches became a silent act of gratitude. They were a team, moving in a silent, coordinated dance of restoration. He was the builder, the mender of broken structures. She was the homemaker, the restorer of comfort and order. The rhythmic sound of his work in the yard became the backbeat to the soft whisk of her broom on the floorboards, the gentle bubble of a pot on the fire. He was rebuilding their fortress. She was rebuilding their home. One afternoon, she decided she could not live with the gloomy, boarded-up window any longer. There was no spare glass, but in the barn, she found an old, discarded piece of translucent, scraped hide, thin and pale, that had once been part of a project Silas had abandoned. It was stiff, but it was intact, using his awl and a length of leather cord. She painstakingly stitched the hide into the broken window frame. It wasn't glass. It didn't offer a clear view of the world outside, but it let the light in. A soft, milky, golden light now filtered into the cabin, chasing the darkest shadows from the corners. When Silas came in that evening, weary from his work, he stopped just inside the door. He didn't say anything. He just looked at the window, at the soft, warm light it cast across the room. He looked at her, and his eyes held a deep, quiet appreciation that was more eloquent than a whole book of poetry. In that moment, she was not the frightened refugee he had sheltered. She was his partner. She, too, was a builder. The days settled into this new normal. A quiet, industrious peace replaced the tense vigil of his recovery. In the evenings, after the work was done and the supper was cleared away, a new ritual was born. They would sit together on the top step of the porch, their shoulders not quite touching, but close enough to feel the shared warmth in the cooling autumn air. They would watch Tom in the twilight, a small, energetic silhouette chasing grasshoppers in the tall grass or practicing with a small bow Silas had made for him. They rarely spoke during these times. There was no need. The words were in the shared sight of the boy, safe and happy. The words were in the solid, rebuilt gate of the corral, standing straight and strong. The words were in the smell of baking bread that still lingered from the cabin, in the neatly stacked pile of firewood beside the door. They had faced the storm and survived. They had been broken and had mended each other. Sitting there, on the porch of the small, resilient homestead, they were no longer two separate, wounded souls. They were a unit, a family, forged not by blood or by vows, but by shared danger and silent, stubborn care. Ellie would look at Silas's profile in the fading light, the strong line of his jaw, the deep-set eyes that watched the boy with a fierce, protective pride, and a feeling would swell in her chest that was so powerful, so profound, it left her breathless. It was a feeling of belonging. She was not a guest. She was not a charity case. She was home. One afternoon, the sun was particularly hot. Silas had been working for hours, replacing the fence posts that had been shattered in the fight. The rhythmic thud of his post maul had been a steady heartbeat all day. Ellie, seeing the sweat staining his shirt and the weary slump of his shoulders, drew a fresh, cool cup of water from the well and carried it out to him. He stopped his work as she approached, leaning the heavy maul against a new post. He wiped his brow with the back of his forearm, his breathing deep and even. He watched her come, his eyes squinting against the sun. She held the tin cup out to him. "Thank you," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. She had expected him to take the cup from her, but he didn't. He simply stood there, his hands hanging at his sides, as if waiting. A silent invitation. Understanding. She raised the cup to his lips herself. It was an act of profound intimacy. He leaned his head forward slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. His lips, dry and dusty from his work, touched the cool metal rim of the cup. He drank deeply, his throat working. The sound of his swallowing was loud in the quiet afternoon. As he drank, her hand began to tremble slightly from the weight of the cup. To steady it, he raised his own hand, not to take the cup, but to place it gently under hers, supporting it. His hand was large and warm, the skin rough and calloused against the softness of her own. For a fraction of a second, as he steadied her hand, the back of his fingers brushed against the tips of hers. The contact was a spark on dry tinder. It was nothing and it was everything. It was a jolt of pure, unadulterated awareness that shot straight from her fingertips to the core of her being. It was not the accidental, shocking touch in the cabin that had sent her spiraling into memory. This was deliberate, gentle, a conscious acknowledgement. She met his eyes over the rim of the cup. The world seemed to fall away. There was no sound but their own breathing. In his eyes, she saw it all, the gratitude, the respect, the deep, unspoken affection that had grown between them in the silence. She knew that he saw the same feelings reflected in her own. It was a kiss that never happened. It needed no lips, no embrace. It was a promise, a question, and an answer, all exchanged in a single, fleeting touch of skin on skin under the hot desert sun. He finished drinking and gently lowered the cup. His hand lingered on hers for a heartbeat longer than necessary before he withdrew it. He took the empty cup from her, his fingers now carefully avoiding hers. The moment was over. "Thank you, Ellie," he said again. And this time, her name on his lips sounded different. It sounded like it belonged there. He turned back to his work, picking up the maul and swinging it in a powerful, fluid motion. The thud of it striking the post echoing the new, steady beat of her own heart. She walked back to the cabin, her legs feeling strangely weak, the feeling of his hand still warm on hers. Nothing had been said, no vows had been made, but in the heart of the vast, lonely wilderness, something had been irrevocably sealed. They belonged to each other, and they both knew it. The autumn that settled over the valley was a season of quiet grace. The relentless hammer of the sun had softened into a warm, golden caress. The air grew crisp in the mornings, carrying the clean, sharp scent of pine from the high country and the dry, sweet smell of cured grasses. The land, which had been a study in harsh browns and grays, was now painted with the softer hues of the dying year, the pale gold of the corn stubble, the deep rust of the scrub oak on the hillsides, the startling, defiant yellow of the cottonwood by the well. Life on the homestead had found its own gentle, unhurried rhythm, a rhythm of healing and quiet growth. The scars on the land were fading. The new corral gate hung straight and true. The pale hide stitched into the window frame had weathered to a soft, creamy color, filtering the afternoon sun into a light as gentle as honey. The physical work of rebuilding was largely done, and what remained was the simple, profound work of living. Each evening, as the sun dipped below the western rim of the valley, casting long, peaceful shadows across the land, they would fall into their unspoken ritual. Silas and Ellie would sit on the top step of the porch, a comfortable space between them, and watch Tom, the boy, who had once been a creature of silent, wary observation, had blossomed in the newfound security of their small world. His laughter, once a rare and startling sound, now echoed freely in the twilight as he stalked imaginary beasts in the tall grass, or sent his lopsided arrows wobbling toward a target painted on an old barrel. These evenings were almost entirely without words. They communicated in a language of shared glances and comfortable silence. When a cool breeze swept down from the canyon, Silas might look at Ellie, and she would give a small nod, a silent agreement that the night was growing chilly. She, in turn, might watch Tom trip and fall, then look to Silas, and see in his eyes the same mixture of amusement and concern that she felt in her own heart. They were weaving a life together, thread by silent thread. On one such evening, the air was particularly still. A full, luminous moon was beginning its ascent over the eastern peaks, silvering the edges of the dry corn stalks. Tom was further out than usual, a small, determined figure near the edge of the wild meadow that bordered the homestead, his attention completely absorbed by the task of trying to catch the first fireflies of the evening. The cabin was a warm, solid presence at their backs, a silent testament to all they had survived and rebuilt. Ellie sat with her hands clasped in her lap, her gaze fixed on the man beside her. In the soft, forgiving light of dusk, he was not the formidable, intimidating stranger from the train. He was just Silas. She saw the familiar lines etched around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. She saw the way his large, capable hands rested on his knees, no longer clenched in fists of rage or pain, but relaxed, at peace. He had a small, faded scar on his jaw that she had never noticed before. She knew the rhythm of his breathing, the low, steady sound of it, a constant, reassuring presence in her life. A wave of emotion so powerful it was almost a physical force washed over her. It was a complex and overwhelming cocktail of gratitude, wonder, and a deep, aching tenderness that had taken root in her soul and grown into something she could only call love. She thought of the girl she had been, a terrified, desperate creature, seeing the world only as a place of threats and transactions. That girl seemed like a stranger to her now, someone from another lifetime. This place and this man had given her not just shelter, but a new self. She had to tell him. The silence, which had always been a comfort, suddenly felt insufficient. Her heart was too full for silence. The words she needed to say were a living thing inside her, pressing to be released. Her hands, which had been resting in her lap, began to tremble. She clasped them together tightly, her knuckles turning white. She took a deep, shaky breath, the cool night air a shock to her lungs. He must have sensed the change in her, the sudden tension in her stillness, because he turned his head slowly to look at her. His eyes, the color of a gathering storm, were not questioning, merely attentive. He was, as always, giving her the space to find her own way. She couldn't meet his gaze. She looked down at her own lap, at her worn, mended dress, at the hands that had learned to cook and clean and nurse a man back from the edge of death. "Silas," she began, her voice a reedy whisper, so quiet she wasn't sure he had heard. But he did not move, did not speak, his silence an invitation for her to continue. She swallowed, trying to force the words past the lump of emotion that had formed in her throat. That first day, on the train. She started again, the memory still vivid, still sharp. The world was all teeth. All I wanted was a place to disappear, a shadow to crawl into for a minute, until the danger passed. She risked a quick glance at him. He was still watching her, his expression unreadable, but his attention absolute. "When I saw you," she continued, her gaze dropping again, "you were so still, so quiet, like a part of the mountain. And that big coat," a faint, watery smile touched her lips at the memory. "It looked like the safest place in the whole world, a place where no one could see me, where no one could touch me." Her voice grew even softer. The words meant only for him, for the quiet space between them on the porch steps. "At first, I only asked to hide under your coat." She paused, gathering all the courage she possessed. She lifted her head, and this time, she forced herself to meet his eyes. In their gray depths, she saw not pity, not curiosity, but a deep, solemn understanding. "Now," she said, her voice shaking but clear, the words a simple, profound truth that came from the very core of her being. "Now, I only want to stand beside you." The declaration hung in the still night air, as fragile and as real as the moonlight. She held his gaze, her heart pounding a frantic, vulnerable rhythm. She had offered him everything she was, everything she had become. "Through the sun," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears, "and the rain, for all the rest of my life." He did not speak. The silence that followed was not empty. It was alive, charged with all the things that had passed between them, the shared danger, the silent acts of kindness, the slow, patient mending of a broken gate and two broken souls. He simply looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw her own raw emotion reflected back at him. He saw her not as a burden, not as an obligation, but as a gift. Then, slowly, he reached out. He did not touch her face or her shoulder. He simply laid his large, warm, calloused hand over her two small, trembling ones where they were clenched in her lap. His touch was gentle, reverent, and then he squeezed. It was not a hard squeeze. It was a soft, firm pressure. A single, deliberate action that said more than 1,000 words ever could. It said, "I know." It said, "I understand." It said, yes, it was his vow, his answer, his acceptance, all conveyed through the quiet, honest language of his hands. A single tear she had been holding back escaped and traced a slow path down her cheek. She did not wipe it away. He kept his hand over hers, a warm, solid weight that anchored her, that told her she was finally, truly, irrevocably home. They sat like that for a long time, hand in hand, as the moon climbed higher and the stars began to prick the deep velvet of the sky. The silence returned, but it was a new kind of silence, a silence that was no longer about things unsaid, but about things so deeply understood that they no longer needed to be spoken. Finally, he released her hand and rose to his feet in a single, fluid motion. He stood at the bottom of the steps, then turned and looked at her, his silhouette dark against the moonlit yard. He held out his hand. She stood up and took it without hesitation, his fingers laced through hers, a natural, perfect fit. He didn't lead her back into the cabin. He led her away from it, out into the yard, past the repaired corral, and toward the wild meadow where Tom was now just a distant, flickering shadow among the fireflies. They stopped at the edge of the field. A late, resilient bloom of wildflowers had sprung up in the tall grass, pale, silvery primrose that opened only to the moon, and the last of the deep purple asters. The air was thick with their faint, sweet perfume. They stood together, hand in hand, and watched the boy. They watched their boy, their future, darting and dancing under the vast, silent, watching sky. He was safe. He was happy. And they, standing together amidst the quiet beauty that had grown in the heart of the harsh, unforgiving land, were whole. The girl who had once trembled and begged for the shelter of a stranger's coat had found her permanent home. It was not a place made of logs and stone. It was a place in the heart of a quiet, steady man, a sanctuary she would never have to leave again. They walked back from the meadow in a silence that was more profound and more intimate than any conversation. The moon, now high and brilliant, bleached the landscape to a stark and beautiful palette of silver and black. Silas's hand, warm and firm, remained clasped around hers. It was no longer a gesture of rescue or of comfort. It was a simple, declarative statement of fact. It was the hand of a man who was walking home with his woman. Tom, his small jar of fireflies blinking with a soft, magical rhythm, trotted ahead of them, his earlier excitement now tempered by a sleepy contentment. He led the way back to the warm, golden light of the cabin. Inside, the small space was a haven of peace. Ellie took the jar of fireflies from the boy, her heart aching with a gentle love, and helped him get ready for bed. Silas stood by the fire, his back to them, giving them their moment. He added a single log to the embers, the wood settling with a soft, domestic sigh. There was an air of finality in the small, everyday gestures, a sense of a circle finally being closed. After Tom was tucked into his cot, his breathing already deepening into the steady rhythm of sleep, Ellie turned. Silas was still by the fire, but he was watching her now, his face cast in a dramatic relief of shadow and firelight. The silence returned, but it was alive. thrumming with the unspoken words of the evening, with the weight of the new reality that had settled between them. The small cabin, which had been a temporary shelter, a place of healing, now felt like the very center of the universe. Without a word, he moved toward the door, pushing it open to the cool, moon-drenched night. He stepped out onto the porch and waited. It was an invitation. Ellie's heart began to beat a little faster, a nervous, fluttering rhythm. This was different. This was the threshold of something new, a country she had never visited, whose language she did not know. For a moment, the old ghosts whispered at the edges of her mind, the remembered fears, the ingrained instinct to flee from the desires of men. But then she looked at his silhouette in the doorway, a figure of absolute stillness and patience, and the ghosts fell silent. This was Silas, and with Silas, she was not afraid. She walked out onto the porch, pulling the heavy door almost closed behind her, leaving just a thin sliver of warm lantern light to spill out onto the rough-hewn wooden planks. She stopped a few feet from him, her hands clasped in front of her, a knot of nervous anticipation tightening in her stomach. The night was vast and silent around them. The only sound, the distant, lonesome cry of a coyote from the high ridges. He turned to face her fully. The moonlight was sharp, carving his features from granite, but the sliver of lantern light from the cabin was soft, catching the warmth in his eyes, the gentle curve of his lips that was not quite a smile, but was no longer a hard, straight line. She had never known a man could be beautiful, strong, yes, intimidating, certainly, but she had never seen beauty in a man's face until this moment. She saw the years of hardship, the solitude, the quiet strength. But she also saw the gentleness he had shown her, the patience he had shown a wild boy, the fierce protectiveness that had nearly cost him his life. It was all there, in the way he looked at her. He took a single, slow step toward her, and then another, closing the small distance between them until he was standing so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. She had to tilt her head back to look up at him. She could smell the clean, honest scent of him, wood smoke, leather, and the faint, dusty smell of the desert night. Her breath caught in her throat. Her body, conditioned by a lifetime of fear, went rigid, an instinctive, defensive posture. He saw it. He saw the flicker of panic in her eyes, the sudden tension in her shoulders, and he stopped. He did not reach for her. He simply stood, allowing her the space, allowing her body to catch up with her heart. He was giving her time. He was giving her a choice. And in that moment of profound, patient stillness, her fear finally, truly, broke. It did not fade. It shattered, like a pane of glass struck by a stone, the pieces falling away into nothingness. What rushed in to fill the void was a wave of trust so absolute, so complete, that it made her feel dizzy. Her shoulders relaxed. The breath she had been holding escaped in a soft, shaky sigh. He saw that too. Slowly, as if he were approaching a timid fawn, he lifted his right hand. She watched it rise. This large, calloused hand that had fought for her, that had rebuilt their home, that had held hers with such gentle strength. She did not flinch. She did not move. She simply watched, her heart thudding a heavy, expectant rhythm against her ribs. His fingers, surprisingly gentle, touched her chin. They were rough, the skin thick with the history of his life's labor, but his touch was as soft as a whisper. He did not grip her. He simply cupped her chin, his thumb resting lightly on her jawline, and gently, so gently, tilted her face up toward his. Her eyes were wide, luminous in the mixture of moonlight and lantern light. He looked deep into them, and she felt as though he were looking directly into her soul. Seeing all the broken pieces, all the mended seams, all the love she had finally found the courage to name. Then he took her left hand. He did not clasp it. He took it by the wrist and, with the same deliberate, reverent slowness, He brought it to his chest. He pressed her palm flat against the solid, unyielding wall of him, directly over his heart. Under her hand, she felt it, a slow, strong, steady beat. Thump, 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 thump. It was the rhythm of his life, of his strength, of his unwavering constancy. It was the truest sound she had ever heard. It was the sound of home. He kept her hand there, pressed against his heart. He kept his other hand cupping her chin, his thumb stroking her skin in a slow, soothing rhythm. And he looked at her. His eyes asked the question his lips would not form. It was a question that held all the respect she had ever been denied. It was not, "May I?" It was, "Are you ready? Can you trust me?" She gave him her answer. It was not a word. It was a closing of her eyes, a slow, deliberate surrender. And then, a nod, a tiny, almost imperceptible inclination of her head, a movement so slight it was more felt than seen. It was the final, quiet unlocking of the last door to her heart. That was all he needed. He leaned down, his movements unhurried, giving her every chance to change her mind, to pull away. But she did not move. She stood, her hand over his heart, her eyes closed, and waited for the final, terrifying, beautiful unknown. His lips touched hers. There was no pressure, no demand. It was a touch as soft and as gentle as a moth's wing. It was warm, and it tasted of coffee and the cool night air. For a moment, that was all it was, a simple, chaste meeting of lips. It was a question, a reassurance. This is all it is. This is safe. A sob of pure, overwhelming relief caught in Ellie's throat. This was a kiss. This was what she had feared her entire life. What she had been taught was an act of ownership, of taking. But this was none of those things. This was a gift. It was an offering. It was a prayer. She felt the last vestiges of her fear dissolve into a profound and bone-deep peace. Her lips, which had been tense, softened under his. She leaned into him, a fraction of an inch, a silent response. He felt the change in her, the subtle surrender. He deepened the kiss, but there was still no demand in it. It was a slow, thorough exploration, a mapping of a new and wonderful territory. It was a kiss that spoke of long, quiet evenings on a porch step, of a wildflower pressed in a book, of a cup of water offered to a thirsty man. It held all their silent conversations, all their unspoken vows. It was a kiss that promised not passion, but permanence, not fire, but a hearth, not a storm, but a shelter. He pulled back slowly, his lips lingering for a heartbeat before breaking contact. He rested his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the cool night air. He had not embraced her. Her hand was still on his chest, his hand still cupping her chin. They stood in the moonlight, contained in their own small, perfect world. He had not asked for permission. He had not needed to. He had waited for the right person, the right moment, the right language. He had waited for her to be ready. And she, the girl who had spent her life as a piece of property, as a thing to be bargained for, was no longer a supplicant asking for shelter. She was a woman, standing on her own porch, with her own man. She was no longer asking for permission to exist. She was simply, finally, home. They belonged to each other, not by law or by transaction, but by the far more powerful bonds of shared survival, quiet understanding, and a love that had learned to speak without words. Thank you for listening to our story. We're curious to know where in the world you're tuning in from. Please leave a comment below to say hello, share where you're listening, and let us know your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and like this video. If you'd like to support us further, please consider hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.